Hello, I am going to welcome everyone, and pursuant to House Rule 10.01, I call the remote meeting of the Minnesota House of Higher Education Finance and Policy Committee meeting to order. The CLR Committee Legislative Assistant, Ms. Mouse, will take the roll call to determine for who is present, and please say your when your name is called, please say present.
Chair Bernardi.
Present.
Vice Chair Christensen.
Present.
Representative O'Neill.
Present.
Representative Albright.
Present.
Representative Daniels.
Present.
Representative Erickson. Representative Erickson. Representative Hansen.
Present.
Representative Heintzman.
Present.
Representative Howard. Representative Howard. Representative Keeler.
Present.
Representative Cleaborn.
Cleaborn, present.
Representative Kosnick.
Kosnick, present.
And Representative Kresha is excused. Representative Mason. Representative Mason. Representative Meckland. Representative Meckland. Representative Sandell.
Present. Present.
Representative Noor.
Present.
Representative Sandsted.
Sandsted, present.
And Representative Thompson.
Present.
Thank you, members. We do have a quorum. First of all, I wanted to welcome everyone to our committee hearing today, and want to thank everyone yesterday for sharing their stories with us about how higher education has impacted them, their families' lives, or their communities. It was very powerful, and I look forward to hearing about Representative Sandell's story, and then I will share my family's as well. So thank you very much for sharing those stories, and I'm hoping that we can have a little time to have a conversation about what we learned. So today with us, we have a presentation by our nonpartisan staff, Nathan Hopkins from House Research, and Ken Savory, our fiscal analyst. Mr. Savory and Mr. Hopkins are here to present an introductory overview of higher education finance and funding mechanisms in the state of Minnesota, and will be giving us an overview of the Regents process as well. We have plenty of time for members to ask questions for each presentation, and so please be jotting your questions down so we can get those answered. And now I will, so we'll have members hold those questions until they get through their presentation, and then we will address those. So Mr. Savory and Mr. Hopkins, you may proceed. Thank you.
Madam Chair and members, again, for the record, Ken Savory from the Nonpartisan House Fiscal Analysis Department. I'll be going first today, so I'm just going to share my screen and then we can start. Thank you, Madam Chair and members, for the opportunity to do this presentation today. I'll be discussing a higher education finance overview of the budget area for this committee. Before we kind of dive in a little deeper into higher education finance in the state of Minnesota, I just wanted to lay out a slide that goes over the budget process for the 2021 session, or the odd numbered year session as often referred to. You'll see on the left-hand side just kind of check boxes, and usually when I have this piece of paper in my office, I check the boxes off as we get to those sort of process points throughout the year. And so we've already had the MMB release the November forecast. In January, the legislature's convened. And then in late January, I believe the 26th, the governor will make the budget recommendations for the executive branch. And then eventually we'll have a legislative bill deadline. So that's kind of the upcoming piece to this. And then additionally, the legislature will receive a February economic forecast in the end of February. And then in March, the Ways and Means Committee and conversely the Senate Finance Committee will also establish budget targets or spending allocations. In April, those omnibus bills, in this committee, the Higher Education Finance Bill, will leave the House floor, and then conference committees will be appointed by the various chambers, and those conference committee discussions will begin. And then in May, before adjournment, those conference committees will conclude, and the governor will sign or veto those budget bills. Moving on, just starting kind of at the 10,000-foot level, the Higher Education Committee here at the House has 4 areas or agencies under their purview. The first one being the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, the second being the Minnesota State Colleges and Universities, or more commonly referred to as Minnesota State. Additionally, the University of Minnesota. And then lastly, a small piece of the budget is allocated typically for the Mayo Foundation for residency programs. These next 3 slides are meant to kind of ground the committee in how higher education financing and state financing has changed from the late 90s up until now, so approximately 30 years of change. The first graph is a pie chart that kind of breaks down the general fund resource allocations in the 1988-1989 biennium. As you can see, the pie chart has several pieces of the pie, some larger and some smaller. You'll see that post-secondary education, or as it's called later, as we move into the late 90s and 2000s, higher education takes up 13.4% of the pie, and the pie is in total spending for $12.5 billion. You'll see that there are larger pieces of the pie, mainly health and human services in the lower part of the pie. And then just to the right of that, K-12 education with approximately a quarter of the pie, 24.5%. Here's the same or similar pie chart several years later, all the way moved up from the late 80s to the mid 2000s. So the budget has changed. It's 31.5 billion. And K-12 education is a significant portion of the pie now, approximately 42%. Health and human services is a larger piece of the pie as well at 26.3%. Other pieces of the pie, as you see on the left-hand side, have also changed or grown. And then you'll see on the right-hand side, roughly in the middle of the screen, that higher education is now 8.8% of that pie. You'll notice too, if you're looking at other areas of the pie, most of this is done via the conference committee process. So in this particular year, if you look in the lower left-hand corner, agriculture and environment finance were combined into one conference committee and are therefore kind of put together. The last pie chart I'll go over kind of brings us to present day, and that's general fund spending in FY20 and 21, based on the most recent forecast for information that the legislature received in December. As you can see, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, higher education is 7.2% of this pie chart, and K-12 education, health and human services have remained roughly the same. Some grown, some have fallen. But I guess what the kind of the objective with talking about these pie charts is kind of just laying out the idea that budgets change, priorities of the legislature and governor also change, and therefore these objectives, pieces of the pie, and financing in general of state government changes with those changes in law. This next slide, I'm just going to go over some common fiscal terms that are often utilized in the Higher Education Committee and in other committees. Speaking specifically about higher education, the general fund is where the committee will make most of its appropriations from. when they put together the Omnibus Higher Education Finance Bill, i.e. the funding mechanisms that for the various state agencies that I listed off before that are under the committee's jurisdiction. The vast majority of these appropriations will be direct appropriations, meaning that the bill will specify that a specific amount of money is for a specific purpose. A good kind of example of that would be if the committee decided to do a higher education program at OHE, they would say $500,000 is appropriated in these specific fiscal years for this specific program. So the money goes directly to the state agency to accomplish that goal. There are two other kind of appropriations that this committee doesn't really deal with very much. That is a statutory appropriation, meaning statute automatically allows money to be distributed to a program or agency. And the second is the third is an open appropriation. An open appropriation is something that isn't typically in a higher education bill, but does kind of pop up in other areas. An open appropriation is essentially a standing appropriation that allows for money to flow directly to an agency or program for a specific purpose on a year-round basis without the legislature having to constantly renew it. A really good example of this is in the environment area, where firefighting, looking after the state's forestry services, is on an ongoing basis. So something like firefighting, which is a natural disaster issue, doesn't have to be constantly renewed. The third term on the list is Operations and Maintenance Appropriation, or O&M as it's often referred to by the committee. O&M is a large general fund appropriation made to the two systems under the committee's purview. So that would be the University of Minnesota system and the Minnesota State system. Next on the list is the state special appropriation. And these state special appropriations kind of have a sort of historical backdrop to them in which there are specific appropriations mainly given to the appropriated to the University of Minnesota for specific research or development purposes. And I'll go into the state special appropriations later in the presentation. Another common term is the state share of higher education or tuition revenue split. Both the University of Minnesota and the Minnesota State system have received revenue in terms of tuition revenue, as well as revenue from the state in terms of state appropriation. From the state's perspective or the committee's perspective in terms of the way they finance them, those are the two largest pieces of revenue in which those systems receive. Additionally, various institutions do fundraising, some receive federal grants for various research purposes, but mainly from the Omnibus Higher Education Finance Bill perspective, there is the tuition revenue and there's the revenue from state appropriation. The last term on the list is the out-year biennium or TAILS. And this refers to the biennium in which the committee will be planning for and which will show up on the finance spreadsheet beyond the committee's appropriations. So for example, the committee this session will be appropriating and budgeting for FY22 and 23, and then the TAILS will be FY24 and 25. This next graph is this next line chart is a good illustration of higher education general fund appropriations from 06 to FY21. This is just kind of to illustrate that as the state's finances have changed, so has appropriations to the higher education area. So see in 06, they climb moderately, and as we hit some of the recession times in 08 and 09 and recovery, the higher education parts of the state budget recover as well, and those kind of climb up, moderate, and then climb up again. The Omnibus Higher Education Finance Bill has a relatively similar format to most finance bills that are Omnibus finance bills that are considered at the legislature. There's typically an appropriations article and then various policy articles that follow that. From the appropriations side, it's broken into the four areas that I talked about earlier. So the Office of Higher Education, a main component of that being the state grant program. There are various financial aid programs that are also riders within that section. And there are other riders like agency administration, various data programs or data riders and things like that also make up the Office of Higher Education section. Minnesota State has a similar construction in which there's operations and maintenance, that large operating chunk of money that is appropriated to the institution. and then designated spending riders within the operations and maintenance. So if the operations and maintenance, to use round numbers, say 500 million, there are likely riders underneath that that say of that 500 million, a certain amount of money is designated for a specific purpose. And we'll see that as I go through the most recent finance bill. The University of Minnesota is very similar to Minnesota State in terms of the structure of the bill. There's an operations and maintenance section, and then designated spending riders that inform the regions on various things that are allocated for. Additionally, after that, there are state special appropriations, which I talked about earlier, that complete that. And then additionally, the Mayo Foundation has 2 riders for the Mayo Medical School and then residency programs. This next chart is from a publication that my office does typically after the legislature has passed all of the budget bills and those have been signed or signed by the governor. This is from the 2019 session, so this is represents the most recent higher education finance bill that was passed by this like committee back in 2019 and then approved by the governor. You'll see on the left-hand side the prior forecast. So in FY18 and 19, that's the forecast that was in February. Then you'll see the forecast base, essentially where the legislature started budgeting from. You'll see what was enacted in the finance bill. And also you'll see various percentage changes in terms of did the legislature allocate more money, stay the same, or allocate less money. If you look on the left-hand side, you'll see the list of the agencies and then the general fund total. But sometimes you'll see something like this where it says Laws 2019, Chapter 65. And that is when another part of the budget is, or another finance bill allocates money directly to an agency under the committee's purview. And so sometimes that does happen and those are included as part of the total that comes to the committee. The 2019 Higher Education Omnibus Finance Bill, this is the pie chart that represents what that bill was constructed of. It was 3.4 billion from the general fund, and this data is from the most recent December 2020 fund balance analysis. You'll see the various appropriations listed in each part of the pie chart, and the percentage of the bill in which they make up from the general fund. A unique way to look at the higher education financing for this bill is to separate out the state grant program from the Office of Higher Education. The state grant program, as you can see on the upper right-hand side, is over $400 million of the Office of Higher Education appropriation. So it represents a big chunk. It's almost like another entity that the committee has to appropriate and deal with. So it's a large percentage. So it's a large percentage, and it often can be seen as a larger part of the pie. The 2019 Higher Education Omnibus Finance Bill had many changes in it, with new money and new allocations. And this is here kind of a list for the Office of Higher Education of what those changes were, and if they were permanent changes or one-time changes. One-time meaning that they don't go beyond the 2021 biennium. I won't go through all of these, but there were changes to the state grant program and formula, primarily being an $18.16 million increase to the allocation. For the agency administration line item, there was a $750,000 increase in FY20 and 21 for a college cost awareness campaign. SLEDS is the statewide legislative educational data system, longitudinal data system. That was a $1.8 million increase. And then various other ones include student loan counseling, grants to College Possible, and then the Minnesota Reconnect program as well, and then emergency assistance for students, both of those being one-time increases. For Minnesota State, there were also changes, a $64.5 million increase to the operations and maintenance area for campus investments. The ISRS Next Generation, or the kind of the backdoor system that helps run the universities, an $8 million increase. Mental health awareness, a one-time increase of $250,000. And then various workforce development, textbook programs, skilled workforce partnerships, and leverage equipment acquisition as well. The University of Minnesota also had some changes, primarily being to the operations and maintenance increase, which was at $43.5 million for the FY20 and 21 biennium. The state special appropriations, as I alluded to earlier, are appropriations that are kind of outside of the operations and maintenance area, in which there are appropriations for a specific set of objectives. As you can see, there are 5 of them. The first one being, and the largest, being agriculture and extension. This $85 million is for the Ag Experiment Station and the Minnesota Extension Service, and then also for general ag research and other research. It's just kind of a broad summary of what that is, and the bill itself specifies the allowable uses for that ag and extension money. Additionally, there's a state special appropriation for the health sciences, which funds St. Cloud Hospital residency programs and the Rural Physician Associate Program and general health science research. There's also one for the Institute, or a state special for the Institute of Technology, which funds the Geological Survey and the Youth Mathematics Program. System special is $14.3 million for the Labor Education Service, Center for Urban and Regional Affairs, the Natural Resources Research Institute, and for general research. And finally, there's also a $15.9 million state special for the U of M and Mayo Foundation Partnership, which is research in biotechnology and genomics, as well as targeted Alzheimer's research. Additionally, to the general fund, the Higher Education Finance Committee will also deal with a very small appropriation relative to the largest size of the budget from the Healthcare Access Fund. This is a biennial appropriation to the University of Minnesota, consisting of, in the most recent budget bill, $4.3 million. This helps to fund primary care education for physicians and family medicine. It was first funded by the legislature in the early 90s and came out of the discussion regarding with the establishment of the healthcare provider tax. So those monies are from the Healthcare Access Fund and then flow to the University of Minnesota for that physician and family medicine preparation and work. These last couple of slides are just a broad overview of another issue that often comes before the Higher Education Committee, and that has to do with bonding. Now, recently the legislature and governor both agreed to a bonding bill, but in the second year of the biennium, it's pretty common that things around bonding and asset preservation having to do with institutions and universities do come to the Higher Education Committee. More commonly, this is referred to as higher education asset preservation or replacement. And they kind of comply with a statutory definition that is in law. Examples of that can be health and safety code compliance, ADA requirements, and air quality improvements, as well as hazardous material abatement. These are typically funded also in a different way through general obligation bonds or various projects at universities. These are backed by the full faith and credit of the state. So if the state isn't able to pay that, by legally they have to levy a property tax. And then from a finances perspective, these projects need to be publicly owned, constitute a capital expenditure, and for a public purpose. And most notably, these bonding projects do require a supermajority of each legislative body in order to move to the governor. And Madam Chair, I know I went a little quickly through those. I wanted to have this presentation be kind of something that can be supplemental to the various larger budget presentations that the institutions will have, as well as the Office of Higher Education. And so it's kind of set the general framework for where those budget discussions will go. With that, I can pause for questions, or we can turn to Mr. Hopkins for his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Savory. I would like to ask members if they have any questions. And I see Representative Sandell has his hand raised. Proceed, Representative Sandell.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Mr. Savory. You mentioned that the state specials were programs which were funded year by year, but were not necessarily, I don't know if audit is the right word, but you said you didn't need a special consideration. How are those state specials reviewed, and is there a
and members. The state special appropriations are part of the regular budget process. So those are considered essentially every year in which the legislature meets. Like a regular direct appropriation in which the legislature and this committee have the authority and power to change those at any budget process time.
Thank you.
Any follow-up, Representative Sandell?
Thank you. No, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Savory.
Okay. Thank you. Representative Mason.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Now, this is the first time I've been on this committee, and it looks like there were some substantial increases. And it seems to me, I also remember maybe the last session where we were really worried about the funding for higher ed. So was this last budget kind of making things better, or are the figures always, those increases always that large?
Mr. Savory.
Madam Chair and members, I just forwarded back or went back into the middle of the presentation. If you see on the right-hand side, you'll see a column that says percentage change enacted versus base FY20 and 21. So from a percentage, from looking at it in terms of percentage, yes, the increases to the Office of Higher Education, Min-State, University of Minnesota, their base budgets did increase. I suppose I'll leave it to the institutions and the state agencies to say if those were appropriate. But I will say from a historical perspective that higher education has waned and waxed in terms of funding with general state shortfalls and general state increases. So I can provide you with some more data that's more in depth in terms of past targets in the past when the legislatures had to make budget cuts to higher education and when they can, or when they have increased the budget as well, if that would be helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have Representative Erickson and Representative Cleaborn on deck. Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Mr. Savory, since I'm new to this committee as well, I'm interested in, and maybe other members are too, on page 13 of the presentation, what is the total, and you don't have to tell us now, if you would just provide us with this data, but what is the total after we've done the increase so that we know how much now is in that particular part of the higher ed program, like the state grant program, SLEDs. I'm very curious about SLEDs. Because that relates to K-12 as well, the grants to teacher candidates program, but all of those that are listed, in addition to what is the total amount now in the U of M and Mayo Foundation Partnership Fund on page 15. If you would provide that information to us sometime soon, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Representative Savory, do you have any comment?
Madam Chair and members, I would say that if you're looking for the top line numbers, this chart that I just moved the presentation to, I believe page 10, will provide you with the actual enacted top line numbers. So for example, the Office of Higher Education, what was enacted in law was $538 million for the Office of Higher Education, and those proceed down the line to the general fund total of $3.4 billion. In terms of the state grant program, I had a piece of paper here with just some notes on it that I did list that. The state grant program at current for the base moving forward is $414,874,000 in the state grant program, which will be the base in the future biennium, which the committee will work with. You asked about the mail.
Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Savory, do you know what the SLED's total amount is now with that increase? Excuse me. And if you don't, you know, we can get these amounts at a later time because I don't want to take precious time.
That's a good idea, Representative Erickson. Representative Savory, can you provide that to the committee after?
Yes, Madam Chair, certainly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. That's more efficient.
Okay, thank you. Representative Cleaborn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I would like to thank Mr. Savory. He's just a wealth of information, and it's so professional and kind to work with. So thank you, Mr. Savory. The point that I'd like to raise today is, could you speak just a little bit, Mr. Savory, about the University of Minnesota's constitutional autonomy? I think for our new members, that might be really important. What it is and what does that mean for our committee?
Mr. Savory.
Madam Chair and members, I think that because Mr. Hopkins is on deck, I think I'll punt that one to him as someone who, Mr. Hopkins is an attorney, and could probably speak to that better than I can. But yes, there is a difference between the way in which the legislature and this committee would allocate funding to, say, Minnesota State, which is more under the committee's control, versus the University of Minnesota, which does have that constitutional autonomy difference. So there are key differences, as you pointed out, between the two systems.
Madam Chair, I would just like to thank Mr. Savory for pointing that out.
Cleavorn.
Thank you, Mr. Savory, for reminding me that Mr. Nathan will also address that. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a very good point. We have two more people that have questions, and then we can move to Mr. Hopkins, and then people are still welcome to ask questions for both of them, but possibly Mr. Hopkins will answer some of the questions that people might have, and we can do them at the same time. We have Representative Albright and Representative Neal on deck. Representative Albright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll defer my question until the conclusion of Mr. Hopkins' presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Representative Albright. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a quick question. I believe you had said there were 67,000 students approximately at the U of M. Do you know how many are in Min-State right now? I'm just trying to do a kind of a calculation of how much we spend per student. And at the University of Minnesota, it's about 20,000 per student per year. Wondering if you know the Min-State number.
Mr. Savory.
Madam Chair and members, I don't have the two continuous enrollment numbers for those institutions in front of me, but I'm happy to follow up later this week.
Thank you. Okay. I still want you all to be asking questions that you want to be asking. And so if somebody wants to ask one before we move to Mr. Hopkins, they just let me know. I do not see anybody in the queue, but I just want to be sure. Okay, so we are going to move to Mr. Hopkins for his presentation, and then we will go back to member questions again. Thank you, and welcome, Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair and members, my name is Nathan Hopkins. I'm a nonpartisan legislative analyst with the House Research Department. I'll share my screen here and start my presentation for you. I was asked to speak today about the regent election process for the University of Minnesota. And the first thing that I wanted to do is kind of set out the context for regent election. And this gets to Representative Cleavorn's question from earlier about the university's constitutional autonomy, just to sort of emphasize the importance of regent elections for the legislature. So the University of Minnesota as an institution predates Minnesota statehood. The University of Minnesota's charter was recognized by the territorial legislature, passed by the territorial legislature in 1851, and Minnesota didn't become a state until 1858. And when Minnesota became a state in its constitution, it recognized the university's pre-existing charter, essentially incorporating that into the state constitution. And the way that this has been interpreted subsequently by the Minnesota Supreme Courts has been that it establishes a unique constitutional status for the university and what we refer to as constitutional autonomy. Basically, this means that the University of Minnesota operates as a separate department of government. It's not merely like a state agency that operates under the executive branch. What this means is that the legislature is more limited in its power to control the university than it is, say, with regard to Minnesota state colleges and universities. That doesn't mean, of course, that the legislature is powerless vis-a-vis the university. The legislature, of course, maintains power via its appropriation authority. And the legislature also has general rulemaking authority or lawmaking authority over the state broadly, which includes the university. So this doesn't mean that the university is above the law, but it does mean that the internal management of the university is committed solely to the Board of Regents. So the legislature's main power over the university in a lot of ways comes through its election of that Board of Regents. And that's something that you all get to participate in as legislators this year. And you have sort of special authority and a special role to play in the regional election process as members of the higher education. Sorry, I need to change my view because I can't see my own presentation right now. There we go. Okay, the composition of the Board of Regents. So under the university's charter, which was, like I said, incorporated into the state constitution, there are 12 regents. They are elected by a joint convention of the legislature. So that means the House and the Senate come together in one room in the House chamber to do this. It's very exciting. It's one of the only times that you see a joint convention of the legislature. Regents are elected to 6-year terms. They've been staggered into 3 different classes. So typically 4 regents are up for election every biennium. And that's the case this year. There are 4 regents currently up for election. And if there are any irregular vacancies, they are filled by the governor until the next election process. I have another slide later on that goes into a little more detail about the process for irregular vacancies. By statute, this is not a constitutional issue, not something in the university's charter. It's a statute that a previous legislature passed. But by statute, 1 member of the Board of Regents represents each congressional district in the state. So we have 8 designated seats for congressional districts and 4 at-large seats. Also by statute, 1 of those at-large seats must be occupied by a current university student. And even though those are statutory rules, not constitutional rules, not part of the university's charter, those have been very strictly adhered to by the legislature in the past. This is an overall review of the election process. The first stage involves the Regent Candidate Advisory Council, RCAC, or RCAC. Their job is to recruit and screen Regent candidates. And then they will interview those people, everyone that applies, and they'll make recommendations to the Joint Legislative Committee. And that typically happens by January 15th of each odd-numbered year. They work very hard to recruit a great group of people and screen them and vet them so that the Joint Legislative Committee has a wonderful slate of candidates before it. They have finished that process for this year. I don't believe the results have been officially communicated to the Joint Legislative Committee, but they have voted on their recommendations, and I have those recommendations listed in the subsequent slide. The second stage in the process is the Joint Legislative Committee. This is a committee this includes both the House and Senate Higher Education Committee members. So this means all of you will be involved in this process. And they consider the RCAC's recommendations. They can also nominate new candidates and vet them, interview them. Typically, candidates are interviewed during the Joint Legislative Committee hearing. And the Joint Legislative Committee will then make its recommendations to the Joint Convention. This happens by February 28th, but it can vary. Finally, the Joint Convention of the Legislature occurs. This receives the Joint Committee's recommendations. New candidate nominations can also occur at the Joint Convention. They can be nominated from the floor. And this is when regents are elected. This usually occurs in early March. And one interesting quirk of this process that sometimes causes some people to complain is that at each stage of the process, even though it's supposed to be sort of a winnowing down of a single group, starting with RCAC down to the Joint Convention, at each stage of this process, new people can be added, even if they haven't gone through those previous stages. So that's a complication, but it's also something that allows the legislature to really make sure that it gets the people that it wants to get, even if they come into the process later than others. So a little bit about the composition of the RCAC. It has 24 members, half appointed by the Senate, half appointed by the House. Members serve 6-year terms. There are also student members that serve just 2-year terms. And there is a 2-term limit for RCAC members. For each chamber's 12 respective appointees, at least 1 has to be a current student, no more than 4 can be current or former legislators, and no more than 8 can be from the same political party. But party affiliation or political involvement is not required for appointment. The duties of the RCAC, they will develop selection criteria, guidelines for regent applicants so that people who apply have some sense for what the RCAC is looking for in a regent. They identify and recruit qualified candidates for open positions. And this is where I think personally, I think RCAC adds a lot of value to the process. These people have very deep networks among University of Minnesota alumni and business communities and elsewhere. So they are able to bring in a great pool of people to apply to become a regent. And finally, they submit recommendations to the Joint Legislative Committee. And they will submit 2 to 4 candidates for each open seat. So this is a bit of a schedule for the 2021 results from RCAC. In October of 2020, they had the call for applications and they started the recruitment process. December 9th was the deadline for applications. Then they went through a preliminary screening process and selected candidates for interviews. Everyone who applied, they had 20 applications. There were 20 interviews, so everyone got an interview this year. Public interviews occurred January 4th through the 7th. And then on January 8th, they voted on their recommendations. So out of the 20 applications, 20 interviews, they recommended 12 candidates total, 3 for each seat. And here they are. These are the people that RCAC recommended to the Joint Legislative Committee this year. You can see that in the 1st district and in the 6th district, you have incumbent regents who are applying to continue as regents. Randy Simonson was elected in 2018 to fill a vacancy, so he is going for his 1st full term as a regent. Michael Shue was elected in 2015, so he's going for his 2nd full term as a regent. And in the 4th and 7th district, neither incumbent regent applied. So these are no incumbent regents is sort of in the running for those 2 districts. As I said earlier, they could change their mind, and at the joint convention, they could be nominated, and they could be elected there. So just because they're not on this list doesn't mean they can't get elected. This is a little bit about the Joint Legislative Committee. It's composed of both the House and Senate higher ed committees. It's co-chaired by the 2 chairs. They meet by February 28th or at any other date set by concurrent resolution. They interview candidates recommended by RCAC, and they accept new candidate nominations. One very notable feature here is that new nominations at the Joint Legislative Committee require 3 House members and 2 Senate members in order to be nominated. One thing that also happens that's more informal, congressional district delegations. So the 7th congressional state senators and state representatives who represent districts within a certain congressional district can come together and decide, we really like this person, and they can submit a letter or testify at the Joint Legislative Committee saying that they like this person and they would like to recommend them for the regent seat for that congressional district. Those are non-binding, but it is something that the Joint Legislative Committee can hear and take into consideration. The Joint Legislative Committee's fundamental job is to recommend candidates to the Joint Convention. By statute, they are supposed to recommend no more than 1 candidate for each vacancy. Because Minnesota is in the unique, especially because Minnesota is in the unique position of having a split legislature in terms of party control, and it has for several years, there is often the case where the committee will truly deadlock and be unable to get the sufficient number of votes to recommend just 1 candidate for a vacancy. So there'll be 2 people and neither of them gets the requisite majority of both House members and Senate members voting for them. And in those instances, the committee has recommended more than 1 candidate for a certain vacancy. So that has occurred in the past. The Joint Convention of the Legislature is controlled by Joint Rule 4.02. Everyone gets together in one big room in the evening usually. They collect the nominations for each open seat. The recommendations from the Joint Legislative Committee are automatically nominated. Any member of the legislature can submit additional nominations at that time, like I said, regardless of whether they've gone through the RCAC process or been interviewed by the Joint Legislative Committee. And then there is a viva voce roll call vote on each congressional district seat. I crossed out student seats and at-large seats in this presentation because we don't have any of those open this year, so they don't really matter for this year's regional election process. The candidate receiving the majority of votes cast for the seat is elected. So every legislator's vote counts the same, whether you're a representative or a senator. And if necessary, there can be subsequent rounds of balloting where the candidate who had the fewest votes in the previous ballots gets dropped until a candidate ends up with a true majority of votes. So this is a little bit about irregular vacancies. No indication that this is an issue this year, but it could happen next year. These can arise due to a regent's death or a regent's resignation. A replacement is appointed by the governor or elected by the legislature if the legislature is in session to serve the remainder of the term. This was the case with Randy Simonson in 2018. So if the governor appoints a replacement before the legislature elects a replacement, the governor's appointee serves until the close of the annual or special legislative session in which the legislature is able to elect that replacement. But if the vacancy occurs while the legislature is in session and the legislature is able to act in a timely manner and elect the replacement before the governor makes his appointment, then there's no longer a vacancy for the governor to fill, and the elected person will fill that vacancy. A little bit here about previous processes, just to show that how it is now isn't necessarily how it has to be or how it always will be. So prior to RCAC's existence, so pre-1988, this process was not as tightly controlled by statute. Roughly, it would occur in 4 phases. Regents would self-nominate for a congressional district seat or an at-large seat, typically by lobbying legislators. Nominees would be reviewed by a caucus of legislators from that district, which would vote to recommend candidates. So this is the congressional district kind of recommendation process that still occurs informally and can be communicated to the Joint Legislative Committee. Then there was a joint meeting of the House and Senate Education Committees, like the joint committee that exists now, which would review the candidates and the congressional caucus recommendations, vote to recommend candidates to the full legislature, similar to what happens now. And then, of course, a joint legislative convention occurs because that's required under the Constitution and the university charter. In 1986, there was an independent study group done on the regional election process, and this is what motivated the creation of RCAC. The goals here were to depoliticize the regent selection process, broaden citizen involvement, and address the perception that the regent positions were part of a political spoils system. So that was the motivation behind the creation of RCAC. In 2005, there's a very brief change in the process, which was sort of interesting. In 2005, the legislature formalized the joint committee in statute, and it also provided an interesting role for the governor. What would happen was the RCAC, instead of making its recommendations to the Joint Legislative Committee, like they do now, would make its recommendations directly to the governor, 2 to 4 candidates for each vacancy. And then the governor would nominate 1 candidate to the Joint Legislative Committee. So you sort of have this process where the governor is coming between RCAC and the Joint Legislative Committee now. So the governor is only recommending 1 person to the Joint Legislative Committee under this process. And the Joint Legislative Committee can only recommend to the Joint Convention the candidate that the governor's nominated. And if the Joint Legislative Committee decides they don't like the governor's nominee, the governor has to submit somebody new. So it kind of requires this cooperation between the Joint Legislative Committee, which represents both houses of the legislature, and the governor's office. This really only happened for 1 round of regional elections. The governor's role was eliminated in 2007. And at that time, the composition of the joint committee was also also somewhat. So it was a very short-lived change. And with that, I'll see if anyone has any questions or anything. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hopkins. Members, are there any questions for Mr. Hopkins or Mr. Savory? Representative Mason. And Representative Albright is on deck. Representative Mason.
Having a problem with the mute button. Thank you, Madam Chair. We know that Minnesota may be in jeopardy of losing a seat. And I'm assuming that after the redistricting, you could have some interesting combinations of whether like two people might be in one district, or, but say if we take out number 7, but there might be 2 remaining people and they still have time to serve. How would we go about dealing with that?
Mr. Hopkins.
Am I clear? Do you understand where I'm going with this?
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair, Representative Mason, that's a great point. Yes, a lot of people have talked about in the next round of redistricting, Minnesota might lose a congressional district seat. I don't know exactly how that would affect the current incumbent regents. My thinking is that because it's only by statute that a region is supposed to represent a specific congressional district, the legislature would have the ability to pass a law to address that if it needed to. What would happen most likely if we were to lose a congressional district seat is that there would just be an additional at-large seat that would come into existence. Regents are supposed to reside in the congressional district they represent. So if districts get redrawn and a regent who's an incumbent in one district no longer resides in that district, it's really up to the legislature how they want to handle that. But they could, because that is the congressional district system only exists in statute, the legislature could pass a law to address it however it's saw fit.
Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Albright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is posed to Mr. Hopkins. Mr. Hopkins, I do appreciate your background context on the autonomy that the university has been favored with. The construct of the RCAC and the legislature's involvement in the region seems to be, dare I say, a convenient form of détente between the legislature and the University of Minnesota. Given the fact that we appropriate funding to them in some fashion, could you speak a little more in terms of how does that not bridge that bright line between their autonomy and our involvement in funding them?
Let's see, who would like to take that? Go ahead. Mr. Savory or Mr. Hopkins?
Yeah, I can, Madam Chair.
Mr. Hopkins.
Yeah, Madam Chair, Representative Albright. Right, so it's correct. The University of Minnesota does receive a large amount of money from the legislature. So the legislature does exercise a certain amount of power over the university via its appropriation authority. Now, when it comes to conditioning those appropriations on certain acts, that is something that's come up before in case law, where the university has placed certain conditions on university appropriations and basically said, okay, university, like you can have this money, but only if you do X, Y, or Z. So there's only been one case before that's dealt with this kind of situation. Basically, the court said that the university can place conditions on appropriations if the conditions promote the general welfare and only make limited intrusions into the regent's management duties. So there are lots of places where the legislature gives money to the university and says, this is only to be used for X, Y, or Z. That's perfectly fine. If the legislature says, you don't get any of your operations and management money unless you fire this professor that we don't like, or something like that, that is really impinging on a power that's the charter dedicates to the regents themselves, that would be a more problematic situation. So regular appropriation authority is certainly a way that the legislature says exercises authority over the university, and it's an appropriate one. The legislature can also place conditions on appropriations, but courts have said that those can't impinge too much on the regents' authority to manage the internal, the university's internal management.
Madam Chair.
Representative Albright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hopkins, then, and to parlay your explanation to something that I know a great deal about. So to some extent, it's an unrestricted gift from a donor to a donee for the purposes that the donee can make of them, and the donor has little or no right to extrapolate what the purposes intended for that gift might be.
Mr. Hopkins.
Madam Chair, Representative Albright. Yeah, so if you look at the appropriations bill, the Omnibus bill, the appropriations to the University of Minnesota, I mean, some of them are tightly restricted. They say this money is only for this. You can only spend this money for the Bell Museum. And that's true. That money can only go to the Bell Museum. And then you have appropriations like the operations and maintenance appropriation, which is the largest chunk of the university's appropriation. And that one is subject to less restrictions. And that's where the regents exercise their authority to manage the university and its affairs. So they do what they do. They use that money as needed at the university. So that appropriation is not subject to the kinds of strict limitations that some of the other appropriations are subject to.
Madam Chair, I just have one follow-up.
Sure, Representative Albright.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hopkins, this is a highly speculative question, and by my posing it, you have every right not to answer it. But is the state obligated to fund the University of Minnesota?
Mr. Hopkins.
No. I mean, the legislature has the power of appropriation, and it can fund institutions as it sees fit. So it's up to the legislature how it wants to use its power of appropriation.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. I actually have a question, and I'm not sure if I missed it, but I was listening attentively. Did you talk about the either of you talk about the state statute about 1/3, 2/3 costs for students' tuition versus the state, what students pay versus what the state helps to support them in their education at higher ed? Mr. Hopkins, or Mr. Savory, who would like to address that?
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. Hopkins.
I did not talk about that in my presentation, but there is a state statute that talks about the model or the goal funding breakdown for the first post-secondary institutions. If you give me a minute, I'd be happy to find it so that I can make sure I have it exactly right.
And then I'd like to follow up with you on that too, and it doesn't have to be at this meeting. Are you able to please share with us how that has changed over the years? The percentage?
Madam Chair?
Mr. Savory.
I do have some data on that. I can just kind of provide the two bookends if that would be helpful, and then I can provide you with a more specific data set in the future if that would be helpful.
Yes.
For the University of Minnesota, in FY 2002, had 32% of their revenue from tuition, and then conversely had 68% from state appropriation. And then if you were to fast forward to 2021, that projection for tuition is 59%, and that projection for state appropriation is 41%.
Thank you.
And then for Minnesota State, in 2020, approximately 66% was from tuition revenue, and then approximately 34% was from state appropriation. And then fast forwarding to 2021, based on projections, approximately 52% will be from tuition revenue, and then approximately 48% will be from state appropriation.
Thank you very much. It would be great to to actually get that spreadsheet for the committee. Thank you.
And Madam Chair,
Mr. Hopkins.
so the funding policy statute is at 135A.01, and it states that the legislature intends to provide at least 67% of the combined revenue from tuition, the university fee, and the state general fund appropriations to public post-secondary institutions. So the statutory goal is stated that the legislature intends to provide 67% of the total, really the total revenues. That's not a binding number. It's a goal that the legislature has set for itself.
Thank you. Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had gotten an email from Ken Savory with the total anticipated students at Min State. And when I did the calculation, I'm just a little confused with the numbers that he was using and what part of the budget he's speaking about, because with the presentation he just gave, the most recent numbers were 1.5 billion for Min State for the biennium, 1.3 billion approximately for the University of Minnesota. But we haven't had the University of Minnesota presentation yet, but I happen to know that their yearly overall budget is $4.3 billion, which is 8.6 billion for the biennium. And when you break out what we actually provide them, 1.3 billion for the biennium out of an $8.6 billion biennial budget, that's 16%. So I'm not quite sure what numbers he's using exactly. I mean, I've talked to Regents quite a bit in the last few weeks here, and I'm not quite sure where he gets to that number, but they also told me in these conversations with the Regents that there are about 67,000 University of Minnesota students, which then is about 20,000 per the biennium, not annually, like I had said, but 20,000 per student for the biennium, where Min State, with the breakdown that I was just given, is about 13,500 for the biennium. So 20,000 versus 13.5 thousand is the difference between the two systems. So the University of Minnesota already gets 6,500 more per student per biennium. And I'm not quite sure where what numbers he's talking about. He must not be talking about the full $8.6 billion budget of the University of Minnesota. So can he just clarify what part he's talking about? Thank you, Madam Chair.
And you're referring to Mr. Savory, right? Representative O'Neill?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay, Mr. Savory.
Madam Chair and members, so I think there's a bit of difference between what the legislature, speaking specifically about the University of Minnesota, there's a difference between what the legislature appropriates via the higher education finance bill and the overall budget of the University of Minnesota. In terms of what we track at the legislature, not what we really track at the legislature, but what the committee really works with is with the general fund appropriation from the higher education finance bill. And so that is the roughly, just gonna make sure I'm checking my math here. That is the roughly 1.3 billion that is appropriated via the higher education finance bill. And then additionally, there are other parts of the university that the higher education finance bill does not cover. So when you speak to a larger amount of money that the university and the regents control and use, yes, there is definitely a difference between what the legislature appropriates via a large omnibus bill versus what is the other components of the university that the legislature does not appropriate specifically for.
Madam Chair.
Representative O'Neill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. When you talked about the percentages of the tuition versus what the state pays, that would be a subset of the full budget of the University of Minnesota. That's where I'm confused, because otherwise it's only 16% of their full budget of what we provide. And you had said something 2 or 3 times that high. So that's where I'm confused. And maybe we can just talk offline, but I know that when we had talked in the past, I wasn't quite sure which part of the University of Minnesota budget you were talking about because the numbers were so different. So, I mean, unless you can say what subset of the University of Minnesota budget it is that you're referring to, but the full budget is 16% of what we provide.
Mr. Savory.
Certainly, Madam Chair. The percentages that are referred to that I think Chair Bernardi asked about or inquired about, those are the breakdown between what the state appropriation is, so what comes out of the higher ed finance bill, and then what is raised via tuition. Those don't include any, say, federal funds that the university would receive or gifts or things like that. So if you just use specifically what the appropriation was versus tuition revenue, those are the breakdowns.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You are welcome. And I will we do have Representative Hopkins, you have your hand raised. Did you have something to add?
Madam Chair, yes, just to sort of get to Representative O'Neill's points a bit. So one way that's when we start to talk about how the appropriation to Minnesota State and how it compares to the University of Minnesota and its effect on students generally, because students could be enrolled part-time or not be taking as many classes, sort of it's hard to do an apples to apples comparison in that way. One of the ways that in higher ed you'll often see people try to do an apples to apples comparison is by using FTEs, what are called full-time equivalents. So the idea there is if you have lots of part-time students at an institution like a community college, you try to aggregate them together so that how many full-time students do all these part-time students equal? Because when you're just doing a head count, institutions that have lots of part-time students that might not even be degree seeking will seem to outweigh an institution that might have a lot more full-time students. So it gets hard to do an apples to apples comparison on the fly. And Ken and I can work on getting a much more thorough comparison to you at a later time if that's something that you're interested in. But just as we have these discussions down the line, that's one thing to keep in mind that comes up a lot when it comes to comparing institutions.
Representative O'Neill, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so the number that I got from Mr. Savory, was the full-time equivalent number, not the total number. So the full-time equivalent number from Min-State, their estimation coming up was 112,949 students. And that's the number that I used to calculate to get to the 13,500 per biennium per student. And so that's about as close, I think, as we can get to kind of literally back of my napkin number of the difference between the University of Minnesota system, which, I mean, we all know that they have revenue streams that are not tuition and are not the state dollars. And again, the state only pays 16% or only provides 16% of their full budget because they do have so many other revenue sources. Then state doesn't have that opportunity. And so just to clarify for the public record, I actually was using the full-time equivalence number, not the total student number. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Savory, do you have any follow-up to that? Or Mr. Hopkins? Oh, Okay, Representative Cleavorn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to, when I first joined the committee, there were things that I was really unsure about. And I appreciated the fact that to Representative O'Neill's concerns about, are these institutions getting the same amount of money? And then as I dug deeper into the numbers, what I discovered is that the missions of the institutions are not the same. So when we look at the missions of the mission of the University of Minnesota, as I dug deeper, when we're talking about both teaching, research, and the extension outreach piece of it. So yes, there are different streams of money that the University of Minnesota has that the state colleges and universities don't have, but they are two very different organizations under one larger umbrella. And I think we have to make sure that we always keep that in mind as we're talking about these funding streams and what it costs, but the mission and the work of those institutions is very different. Thank you.
Okay, I see that if anybody, I don't see any more questions, hands raised. I just want to make sure that that is accurate. If somebody is having trouble raising their hand, I just want to give them the opportunity. Oh, okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Savory and Mr. Hopkins. We appreciate your presentations today and appreciate the members' questions. Thank you very much. Okay, so I would like to, before we move on to the suspense of Representative Sandel's, what he's going to share with us about his how higher ed has affected his and his family's life, I would like to make a motion to approve the minutes for January 12th. May I have a motion to approve the minutes for January 12th, 2021?
So moved, Madam Chair. Shelley.
Representative Christensen moves approval of the minutes of January 12th, 2021. Any discussion? Seeing no hands raised, hearing none, those in favor say aye.
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 Those opposed? Those opposed? The motion prevails and the minutes for January 12th, 2020 are approved. Okay, well, again, thank you everyone for sharing their stories yesterday. And sorry, Representative Sandell, we weren't able to fit yours in, and I'm really looking forward to how higher education has impacted your life, your family's life, or your community. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I said yesterday, I'm honored to share the agenda today with you. And I was interested yesterday when I heard everybody else talk about their experiences and their paths to this responsibility, that it seemed like there was such variety in the discovery that we all made before we found ourselves on the screen. On the other hand, I thought there was something really that we all held in common. It seems to me that higher education is the pursuit and discovery of knowledge and information and skills, no matter what age, whether you're an older person or a young person just discovering things that are in front of you. It doesn't really matter either what discipline it is, whether you're a physicist studying string theory, or if you're a child just learning what the word "the" looks like on paper, or what a quarter note sounds like, or what it feels like to make a mark on a page or make something work that you had invented. It doesn't matter that one discipline or it doesn't seem to me that one discipline has any more authority or any more importance than another. When I was in junior high, I learned that you could actually go to high school at the University of Minnesota. I found out how to do it, and I did. I loved it. I spent a couple of years on the University of Minnesota, and still have very close friends with those I went to school with, and I still have strong feelings about the buildings on the campus and the classes that I took there. When I was a junior in high school, I read a novel by Scott Fitzgerald called This Side of Paradise, and maybe some of you did as well. But it taught me that there was a world, not only a world, a geographic world, but also a world of emotions that was beyond South Minneapolis, where I grew up. And so I decided to do what I could to explore that world. Well, I did, and I enjoyed every moment of it that I spent at universities and in graduate school. But I think after I taught school for a long while, and I taught elementary, junior high, senior high, college, and graduate school, but the most important and the most exciting moments in a classroom was when the teacher and the students both learned something new. And those were the best days in the classroom. And I think that all of us on this screen today learn something new every day in the work that we do. And I think each one of us is excited at the discoveries we make. I was never the smartest kid in class, but I always thought it was a challenge and an adventure to judge myself against the most daunting responsibilities. And this is certainly one of them. So I appreciate the patience all of you had yesterday while I got lost on my computer, and I certainly appreciate hearing all the stories. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Now I'm having the mute issue. I appreciate you sharing your story. Thank you. Very interesting. So now I'll share my story. Higher education is a major factor that influenced mine and my family's life, and I'll tell you why. And it goes back to my parents. My mom and dad grew up in southwestern Minnesota, and in a small town. One had a little community college that my mom grew up in, if anyone's heard of Tracy, and my dad actually grew up on the banks of Plum Creek in Walnut Grove, and he actually lived on a house on the prairie that had no running water and no electricity. They did get electricity when he was about a preteen, but never did have running water other than Vince, go get the water, he tells me. So he and my mom were teenage wed parents, and they both were able to finish high school, and then they moved together. They got married, obviously, and not obviously, but they got married. They came to the Twin Cities my dad came for a job, and when he got here, he wanted to advance his skills, and he took some courses at Dunwoody Institute to be able to have a more skill set from math classes, and he did refrigeration, even though he didn't get into that field, but it helped him to get a better job. And he was able to work in a manufacturing job as a mechanical inspector, and had a 30-year career with one company before he retired. My mom went back to school when I was she went back to work when I was about 6 or 7 years old. And her boss told her, you're really smart, you should go to college. Well, she quit her job and she decided to take 2 classes that summer to see if she could handle it. And she got 2 A's, and she decided that she could do it. My mom ended up being the top female freshman of Anoka Ramsey Community College, and she earned her 2-year nursing degree from there. I get emotional about this because I'm so proud of my parents. Yeah, I'm like Representative Basin yesterday. But anyway, she went on to get her 4-year degree and then her master's degree. And she worked as an industrial health nurse eventually. She actually taught at Minneapolis Community College as well. So my parents ended up retiring when they were 55 because my mom got laid off, and my dad was 57, and manufacturing was dwindling in the United States at that time. They sold everything. They sold their house and sold everything and bought a motorhome and traveled the country for 14 years. And they ended up going to places, staying for 2 days or 14 days for 14 years. So they had quite the retirement. And that really instilled to me the hard work that my dad did and my mom, and the importance of education. And so that really helped me when I went to college, and I went to the same community college, and I was able to transfer to the University of Minnesota in about 1.5 years, and I was able to get my degree early within about 3.5 years. And so I thank my mom and my dad for setting the example of hard work and education. So that's my story, but I have something else to add this year, and I didn't know if I was going to share this or not. And this could be pretty emotional, but and maybe I shouldn't share it because it is. But September 30th, I found out I had breast cancer. And okay, I'm gonna calm down here. And I actually was really fortunate that I did because it was so small that they couldn't even find it on a 3D mammogram. And so I went to our University of Minnesota, and within 27 days, I had that breast cancer removed. And I saw the importance of the research that's been done at the University of Minnesota. They were able to apply it to have the least invasive surgery and the best, great outcome. And I'm so happy that the cancer is gone. And I'm so grateful to have had that University of Minnesota and all the research they've done to help me through this point in my life. So thank you for letting me share my story about how the University of Minnesota has impacted my life, as well as how education and higher education has impacted my family's life. Thank you.
See, Connie?
Representative Sandell, yes.
Madam Chair, I did forget to say
Yes.
something. I saw Representative Heinzman's name on the screen here, and I heard his story yesterday, and I was impressed with it. I just wanted to remind Representative Heinzman that in 2019, I did carry the bill that funded college in the schools, PSEO, and concurrent enrollment. Now, Representative Heinzman doesn't owe me any tuition money for that bill that I carried and passed, but I do have a couple of votes that he could pass my way, and I'll just remind him of that a bit later on.
Okay, Representative Sandell. Okay, well, what I was I'm so glad we had such a great presentation today, and we were able to have a lot of questions, and I was hoping to have a little bit more time today to be able to reflect on yesterday. So I know Representative Sandell reflected a little bit on yesterday, and maybe if we have some time in some of our future committees, we might be able to reflect on that. So what I want to ask you to do is, in that conversation that we had yesterday, or the stories that we heard of people's lives, what stood out for you? What were the things that really moved you? What are the themes that you saw? What are all the different aspects and the different elements that were related to higher education? There were so many, and I would really love to capture that from the committee. So I'm hoping at some point we can have reflect together as a group on what we heard and capture all those different things. So please be thinking about that. And I want to let you know that there is a Regent forum that the University of Minnesota Alumni Association puts on. And I am going to ask our committee administrator, Sean Herring, if he could share that. Share the date on that. I believe that I can share it, but if he has it off the top, it is 5 o'clock. Go ahead, on the 19th. Go ahead, Sean. Mr. Herring.
Madam Chair, members, I think you got that exactly right. It is 5 o'clock on the 19th. I believe the Alumni Association has sent an email to all members, but if you don't have that, let me know. I'm sure to get that information to everybody who's interested.
Excellent. And then I will just give you a little preview again of next week. And of course, it's not coming up in front of me, but we are going to be having the Office of Higher Education next week to talk with us and give us an overview, which is very interesting each time we have that. And then after that, we are going to be taking in student testimony about their current experience with higher education. So we can have their voices at the table and be able to learn from them. So we have gotten through the agenda, and I want to thank all of our members for being here today. And I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Herring.
I did just want to flag, I believe Representative Hansen has raised her hand here, if we have one more.
Okay, so sorry. Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Chair Bernardi. I just wanted to pause for a second and say thank you for sharing your story. And I'm so happy to hear the good news that you were able to get the care you needed at the U of M, and that was really moving, and I'm so happy for you. So thank you again for sharing your story.
Well, thank you very much. And I appreciate the well wishes. I shared it with my colleagues, both Democrats and Republicans, and the outpouring of concern and notes I got was very appreciative by everyone. Thank you. Okay, did I miss any other hands that were raised? Okay, well, thank you very much. And
Thank
our
you.
meeting for our meeting, oh, sorry, I'm getting my video off. Thank you very much. Our meeting today is adjourned.